everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we are doing my December wrap up. Gotta wrap up the last month of the year before we can really dive headfirst into end of year wrap ups. So let's just get into it. In December, I read 6 books and I had 2 DNFs. I did get to the last 2 books on my TBR clear out project, which was great, which was Clan of the Cave Bear and A Half-Built Garden. These were my 2 DNFs, so we'll just talk about them right off the bat. So I'll start with A Half-Built Garden by Ruthanna Emrys. This is a sci-fi that's like a first contact sci-fi story, and this I think had some interesting ideas to it, especially around like why the first contact is happening. Essentially, the idea in this is that this alien race shows up on Earth and tells humanity that they need to leave Earth because they have seen again and again any planet that has intelligent life, when it reaches a certain level of technological advancement, they either have to leave their planet and go somewhere else in the universe to live with their technology, or their planet will essentially like implode, not like literally, but they'll essentially just like burn themselves up and destroy the planet and themselves in the process. And they have this idea of like, they say, you know, your planet was never meant to be a home, it was meant to be an incubator to kind of get you to that point of advancement that you can then move on. And I think that's an interesting idea, an interesting premise, but I never really got invested in the story. Granted, you know, I can be a very hard sell on sci-fi and I don't love a first contact story to begin with, but also I just felt like I never really got invested in the characters. There are quite a few characters and yet none of them were particularly distinct to me. I never really got invested in like the story because so much of our time I felt like was just spent talking about either the way that you know, Earth culture has changed, or about alien culture instead of like actually having a story. Anyways, that's why I DNF'd it, but it wasn't terrible. I just was like, I just don't think this is for me and I don't really care that much. And then my other DNF was Clan of the Cave Bear by Jean M. Auel. This is, they say it's historical fiction. It's kind of fantasy, but it is about, it takes place in the Ice Age. We're following a little girl whose family dies right at the beginning of the book, and she is kind of all on her own, but then she is found and taken in by a Neanderthal clan. And I didn't get very far into this. I got about 56 pages in. This is another one that I was really bored while I was reading this, and there was a point where I realized like it took me a full week to get like 30 pages into this book because I could not get invested in it. I think that the writing itself was fine. I liked the first chapter of this, but ultimately I really didn't like the authorial voice in this. I felt like it was really weird how the author would talk about the characters in this very external way that I saw in other reviews. People describe it that it sounded like a documentary narrator, and I think that's really true. That is kind of what it sounds like. It is this external voice telling you about these characters from the outside, and also using very like modern scientific or anthropological terms to describe these characters. Like when they're describing what the characters look like, describing their occipital bone, and just things like that, where it clearly sounds like a kind of anthropologist from the outside describing these characters instead of telling a story. And overall, the writing was very description heavy in a way that is very telling, not showing. It was a lot of just exposition about how things work instead of being really in it with the characters. So I was having a really hard time getting invested and caring about anything. Also, the Neanderthal culture, which is real, I know there's a lot about how this author did a lot of research, but honestly, the choices that she made about how to depict the Neanderthal culture, maybe it's super accurate. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm interested in reading about it. There were also things, since I wasn't enjoying it, I kind of looked up some other reviews for it, and there are some events that happen later in the book that I was like, oh, I really don't want to read about that. Even if I was enjoying the rest of this book, I would probably really dislike some of these events. But I'm not enjoying the experience of reading this book, so I was just like, there's no point in continuing this. Like, I think that the plot is gonna make me mad, and I'm not having a good time with like the writing and the authorial voice. Oh, also, I will say, so this says that it's historical fiction. There is a fantasy element about the Neanderthals kind of having this like ancestral memory bank, where they can like remember things from previous generations, but that prevents them from learning anything new and ever making any innovations or changes to their culture, because the memory bank is full, and so they cannot integrate new information into it. Otherwise, it would make their heads larger and then they wouldn't be able to be born. Which, I was like, first of all, that is fully just fantasy magic, and as far as fantasy magic goes, that is nonsensical. Like, that's not interesting or good or like make for an interest. It just is an excuse to be like, and the Neanderthals will never ever change or grow or improve in any way, and is also therefore, I'm assuming, I didn't read the book obviously, I'm assuming that this is going to be some kind of explanation as to why the Neanderthals died out, because they were unable to evolve, which I'm like, that's ridiculous. This is just ridiculous. Anyways, so this was a DNF. So on to the books I actually finished. I read 3 books from the Penrik and Desdona series by Lois McMaster Bujold, which were The Physicians of Vilnock, Assassins of Thassalon, and Testimony of Mute Things. So the first 2, Physicians of Vilnock and Assassins of Thassalon, are both rereads, part of my chronological reread, and I gave both of those 3.5 stars. Assassins of Thassalon, I didn't realize was actually much longer than the rest of the books in the series, because most of the books are novellas, but Assassins of Thassalon I think is like over 300 pages, and I listened to all of these as audiobooks. But still, I didn't realize it was so much longer, that there is actually like a novel-length book in the series. And then Testimony of Mute Things is actually a 2025 release, but it messed up my chronological reread because it was just released, but it takes place way back and I should have read it like months ago, but it hadn't been released then. So I think it's like book number 3 or 4 chronologically. So I read that one for the first time, and it's kind of a mystery. A lot of these include like a little bit of a mystery. So there is somebody who dies and Penrik is trying to figure out like, was there foul play and why would somebody murder this person, and all of that. And I gave that one 3.5 stars as well. Then I read The Forsaken and the Fated by Camilla Rains. This is the second book to The Hollow and the Haunted and the last book in the duology. This is a YA paranormal romance. In the first book, our main character is from a family of psychics. They live in a town where there are a lot of different psychic families, and he doesn't normally get visions, but he's able to like see ghosts and stuff. But then one day he starts getting visions of a boy who is going to die, and then he finds out that that is a boy of a rival psychic family. And so then the two of them are trying to figure out how to prevent his death and uncovering family secrets and maybe falling in love. And I just felt like this duology was so fun. I just think the characters are really likable. The premise of like the setup of the first book sounds very similar to The Raven Cycle by Maggie Stiefvater, which is why I kind of read this in the first place. So that was kind of fun. I would say vibes wise, this series feels probably more similar, like in terms of paranormal things, I would say more similar to something like Supernatural than to something like The Raven Cycle, where The Raven Cycle is very like dreamy kind of feeling, and this is much more like we're gonna exorcise some ghosts. It's much more like ghost busting kind of thing, and like possible ritual sacrifices and family secrets and all of that. So I would say it feels more akin to the way that Supernatural treats like paranormal things, although it doesn't have, like, the plot is, and the characters are totally different. But one of the things I liked about this you know, follow-up or this conclusion to the series is that we got more of the side characters, more of the characters' families, and that was really fun to like kind of flesh out the characters around the main couple that we were following. And yeah, I just had a really fun time reading this, and this was 4 stars. Then I read The Isle in the Silver Sea by Tasha Suri, another Lady Night 2025 release, so rounding out my Lady Night books for the year. This is a standalone fantasy that is set in kind of like an alternate England, where there is this kind of magic that like literally holds their world together, where there are these stories that are kind of reincarnated and reacted out again and again through generations, and those stories, as I said, are reincarnated into people. But if one of the people in that story dies, or for some reason that story isn't able to be like acted out, then parts of the world literally start disappearing. And so these stories are kind of holding the world together. But there are also some bad things about the way in which these stories are holding the world together and potentially kind of giving power to certain people in this world. Of course, those in power are also trying to control and manipulate these reincarnated story characters in order to preserve these stories and make the stories be what they want to maintain their power. And so the 2 main characters that we're following are characters from one of these stories, that is The Witch and the Knight, which is this kind of tragic love story between a witch and a knight. And so we're following them from the point where like the first time they meet, and then they kind of are trying to avoid each other, but circumstances end up putting them on a quest together. And it is about them trying to save a friend, but along the way trying to avoid this fate and maybe fight back against the powers that be that are trying to force them into this deadly story. And I think that it had some interesting themes, especially around the power of stories and how stories are used to control and manipulate a populace, and making very literal the way in which stories and the identity that those create also create and prop up our world. So those were kind of interesting and kind of similar themes to The Everlasting. It also had this romance that was like, I'll find you lifetime after lifetime. However, I just didn't feel like this one executed those themes as successfully. Some of it's a little maybe personal preference. I don't particularly like that it made those themes so literal in the way that they are, you know, depicting like the power of stories and how stories prop up the world and power. Some people might jive more with that, I don't know, but it just like, it was a little too on the nose, a little too literal for me. I think also in terms of stories that are like a romance of like, I'll find you in every lifetime kind of romances, one, that's not my favorite, but also there are different ways to do it. And I think that this was a I didn't like this approach as much. I think what worked for me in something like The Everlasting is that we are following the characters from the first time that they meet, and then we're seeing them meet each other again and again over these different iterations of themselves. What happens in this one is more that the characters are meeting, these incarnations of these characters are meeting for the first time, but they have all of these past lives where they have known each other. And so those past lives are influencing them falling in love with each other and the relationship that they have. And so that is less interesting to me because the part of the story that we're watching, it just feels like we don't get a lot of the actual like building the relationship in the now, because it's relying so heavily on like, well, they have lifetimes of loving each other, and that's kind of transpose those feelings onto now. I think that that was one of the things I was kind of having a hard time getting invested in their romance, because I was like, I conceptually understand what you're saying, but my emotions are not engaged. So I'm trying to like, the light is like attacking me. I'm gonna have to like cover a window. But I just think that ultimately it kind of lacked an emotional depth for me. But if you like that trope, then it could work really well for you, you know? It really, I think, depends on how well that trope lands for you. Although I did think that there were parts of this that did really lag, and I really felt like it could have been tighter in the plotting. However, it was kind of funny because the magic in this in some ways really reminded me of the magic in the 500 Kingdoms series by Mercedes Lackey, because that also has this concept of the tradition, which is this kind of omnipotent force in the world where if your life in any way starts to resemble like a fairy tale, this force of the tradition starts to manipulate your life to force you into living this this like fairy tale. And then in that one, there are fairy godmothers who their role is to save people from having to live the fairy tales, especially the really tragic fairy tales. But anyways, just conceptually, this reminded me a lot of that series, which I liked when I was in like high school, so that was kind of fun. But I gave this one 3.5 stars. And then my last read of 2025 was The Wild Huntress by Emily Lloyd Jones. This is a YA standalone that's kind of part of a companion series, that there are multiple books that take place in the same world, but they are standalones. But in this, we are following 3 characters who are about to join the Wild Hunt. So every, I think it's 5 years, maybe, there is this wild hunt that is put on by 2 kings. I think one is like a fae king and one is a human king, but it is this sort of tradition to maintain peace and bonds between their kingdoms. And our main character in this is a huntress that she hunts magical beasts. And one of our other POV characters is a prince from a neighboring country who has made a deal with his uncle, who is the king, and he needs to win the wild hunt in order to win this like bet that he has made. And so he enlists the huntress to help him win the wild hunt. And then along the way, they also encounter another prince who is really trying to prove himself and prove to himself that he is not a monster. And so the 3 of them kind of end up teaming up and going into the wild hunt. And this one, there are a lot of like things that I think could have been improved about it, but ultimately I had a really fun time with this. I enjoyed like the setting and the vibes of them like going on this hunt in a magical forest, and these 3 main characters all getting to know each other. I liked the writing in this, and what I liked about it is that I felt like the writing was engaging, but also did not feel like it was writing to the quote. Sometimes I feel like a lot of books that have been coming out in the last few years, it feels like they are a bunch of quotes that they want for marketing. That's like a bunch of quotes strung together with a plot. And this one, while I think it is well written, it did not feel like it was writing for the purpose of creating quotable moments, and I appreciate that. Some of the things that I felt like could have been better, for one thing, I think that it was maybe too like telling, not showing character emotions and motivations. There was a lot of characters either just like telling each other way more information than you would normally tell a person you just met. Or like thinking to themselves, being like, and this is my motivation and these are my traumas that have created it so that I am like this. And I just like, this is a little much. I think I'm a little more lenient on it because it is a YA. I still think that YA books can be written in such a way that, you know, trusts the audience to be able to like, you know, understand and infer like what are the character motivations. But I do also think that in a, you know, age range targeted at a younger audience, there is also space for books that kind of handhold you along a little bit more and tell you a little more directly like what the character's emotions and motivations are. And so like I was a little more lenient on that. However, I also will say one of our main characters describes himself as like a trickster. And while I was reading this, I was like, when have you been tricky? He does one sleight of hand. And then like there's not, that was a moment that I really was like, or not a moment, but something about his character that I really felt needed to be shown more, because he just kind of starts telling us that he's a trickster, and there really isn't that much about him that feels trickster-like in his personality, in his actions, and I just really felt like something there needed to be fleshed out so that I believed that he was a trickster. And then there were also just parts of the world building that I felt like could have been explained a little better. There was some context I felt like I was missing, especially in terms of like the different countries and kind of who's who. And that is possibly, so these are all standalones that are set in the same world, and technically this is the third one. I think you're supposed to be able to read them as complete standalones. However, I wonder if some of my questions about the world building and understanding like who's who, how are these characters connected, like what kingdom is that, I wonder if some of that may have been answered if I had read the other standalones in this world. But I was kind of confused, especially the two male POVs that we were following. I knew that like they're both parts of royal families. Who are these royal families? Don't know. And I really would have liked a little more clarity on that. However, one of the things that I did really like about it also was the way it ends. I think it's an ending not everybody is going to like, but what I really liked about it is that it is a little more like emotionally ambiguous than what I was expecting from it. It's not ambiguous in terms of like the events that happen, but it's a little more, it's a little bittersweet. It's not like clear-cut happy ending kind of ending. And there were some things that like I wasn't really expecting to happen. And I really appreciated that, especially because I had felt like, you know, it was a little too hand-holdy about like, here are the character emotions and motivations. And so to end in a way that feels a little more emotionally complex than what I was expecting from that, I really appreciated. So I definitely would read more from this author. And even though I have criticisms of it, I generally had a really good time with it, and I gave this one 4 stars. So those are all the books that I read in December, my final reading of the year, and I'm glad that I could end on a positive note. But please let me know, how was your December reading? How do you feel, you know, you ended the year? I would love to know. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye.